The opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations. To determine which investments may be appropriate for you, consult with your financial advisor. When it comes to financial management, Americans are generally encouraged to spend less, save more, and plan for the future. That's important, but is it possible to become so focused on saving for the future that you forget to live in the present? Whether it's skipping experiences, delaying major life decisions, or feeling guilty about spending, financial discipline can become financial deprivation without the right balance. So how do we find it? Joining me today is Jerry Smith of J.L. Smith Associates. Financial discipline, is often viewed as a positive trait, and I think we focus a lot on it, and it has its benefits. But are there situations where maybe people can take that to the extreme?
Well, here's the way I look at this. I started when I was 19 years old dealing with people that were 65 plus doing planning, and they came from different generations, the greatest generation, the lost generation. Now I deal with baby boomers. And often what you would see is that people would have a tendency to do without trying to plan for retirement. And what would happen is that they often would accumulate more money than they ever needed for retirement, and then spend an entire lifetime not doing anything, enjoying anything. And I think what happens is sometimes it becomes this fine line that you focus so much on what you think that the future is going to be that you change your whole mindset as far as what your expectations of life are, what you dream about doing. You just go into a mindset of living the status quo.
There's some fear maybe to that too. Like some people, depending on how they grew up or whatever life experiences they've had, like they're fearful to lose all that money one day. So it's kind of like my sister is a great example of this. She just got out of college, debt free. She has a job and she just bought a new car, and she is trying so hard to pay it all off at once because she just doesn't like the idea that, she has a loan out for it for $20,000, which is interesting to me.
Yeah, I think in some cases, it makes sense to, try and pay things off, try and not have a lot of debt. I think that when you look at the mindset of a younger person, let's just take as an example, your sister as an example. You can have this thought that you don't want this debt. And so like in her case, she could take money, everything that she had, trying to pay this car down as fast as she can. And I think so many times, especially when we're younger, what we don't take into account is that our planning is based on everything going right. We maintain our job. Our car doesn't break down. Things that can happen in life, in a negative way just don't happen to us. We can live life based on everything going the right way instead of taking into account that things can go wrong. So like in her case, if she was paying extra the car and paying it down, but at the same time, she had enough money that if she lost her job, she could maintain her lifestyle for 6 months. We might look at it one way. But if all of a sudden the mindset was just to take everything and pay the car down, but not take into account that something could go wrong, she could lose her job, car could break down, any one of 100 things that could happen that had an adverse consequence, then you kind of look at it a different way, because that preparation for not having any debt and living frugally at that point when you're younger, the first thing you should probably do is just say to yourself, can I survive if I had no money for 6 months?
And that's such a great point. I'm glad that you bring that up, because I think it's easy to hyper-fixate on one goal, whatever that might be for you. I think we don't plan enough for that kind of unexpected element of life when it comes to our finances. How do you strike the right balance?
Well, I think this is, my frame of mind, especially when I was younger, was the fact that you never know when something can go wrong. And so my first goal, and I would say this to younger people when I'm talking to them, and they'll ask me a similar question. My first goal was to say, well, what happens if things go wrong in life? And if I look at what it takes for me to go 6 months, my first goal should be to have 6 months back to protect myself, so that, because I was always a big believer that if I had 6 months to figure out and solve a problem, that I could. And then what happens is you get a little bit older, maybe the budget gets a little bit bigger, and you say, well, maybe I need a year's worth in case something goes wrong, because, then things like an illness or something like that could come in that, you don't really think about when you're younger. When you mentioned something about fear earlier, and you positioned it as if, people, they're afraid that something might go wrong. They're afraid that, like in your sister's case, maybe she's afraid to carry that debt, maybe in case she did lose her job or something. But a lot of times what I've noticed through the years is that the fear is a big contributor to a lot of issues in life, and especially fiscally. So one of those fears is just simply having a fear of making a decision, for fear of making a bad decision, whether that's where you put the money, how much money you save, what your outlook is. And when you live in fear like that, it causes you to really not make a decision. If you're afraid of making a decision, if you're afraid of making a bad decision, then a lot of times you just don't make a decision. And so a lot of times people just fail to plan. And then it also causes them to go to the other extreme. They plan, but they're so afraid of making a bad decision as they're planning that they forget that their timelines change, with their expectations, and life changes. You have all these things that as you get older change. You don't have the same mindset at 20 that you do at 30. You don't have the same mindset at 30 that you will at 40. So when you're afraid of really making decisions, you have a tendency to just live life based on where you're at the time, and just kind of focus on, not doing anything to rock the boat. But then that develops a mindset of stagnation, where you just stay in place. You never really enjoy anything. You don't go do anything. You stop dreaming. You start wanting to accomplish more. You just kind of live in place.
And I'm glad you kind of went into that a little bit, because I was going to ask what drives some of that fear. How have spending habits or attitudes and mindsets about money changed over your career?
Well, because really when you think about it, those earlier generations, they went through things like world wars, Great Depression. So frugality at that juncture was based on the fact that they were having to live with real adversity that we haven't seen for a long time. We haven't seen a Great Depression. We haven't seen world wars. And so people kind of forget that those adversities, we take for granted that those adversities are in the past, that we would never deal with those type of adversities again. But I think that, every generation deals with different types of adversity. And when you're not taught to overcome adversity, those past generations taught the next generation to overcome adversity. And I think along the way, we kind of got away from some of that. And so people fear making decisions. They fear dealing with adversity. And sometimes it's a matter of, if people think if we ignore it, if we pretend it can't happen, if we pretend that nothing can go wrong in our lives, maybe that'll happen. And then the first time, because keep in mind, not making a decision about how you handle your finances, what your goals are in life, When you're afraid to make a decision and you don't make a decision, that is a decision. And when that doesn't go the way that you expected it to, now all of a sudden you're faced with the fact that you made a bad decision.
Yeah.
So then you're fearful of making a decision even more because you inadvertently made a decision unintentionally, which was not making a decision to begin with, and letting your environment, whatever going on around you, dictate the outcome of your current lifestyle. I'm a big believer when I was younger that I looked at it like you had a choice in life. You could either pay attention to what was going on around you and try and be proactive and trying to steer where you were going, because there's things in life you just can't control. But sometimes what happens is people, they allow their environment to totally dictate their future. And when that happens, then you kind of settle in, become frugal, because you're just trying to make the best of a bad situation out of fear of moving forward.
How can somebody overcome that fear? Or kind of even like you were mentioning earlier with the older generations kind of working their whole lives because they were afraid that they wouldn't be able to live on retirement savings and then not getting to reap the benefits of what they spent their whole life working for. How do you change your mindset or start to try to overcome that?
Well, I think that the first thing that you have to do is understand that, mortality becomes a reality. And so, you're in at that stage in life. You're in the fourth quarter. And so when you're there, you need to understand that you actually have two pools of money going on in your life. You've got the pool of money that you're living life on and doing the things you want to do, buying the things that you want to buy. You're just enjoying life. And then there's a certain amount of money that you're never going to spend. It's going to be more than likely inherited by a surviving spouse or other heir. And when you can identify those pools, then it makes a big difference, because when you understand what it is that you own asset-wise that you're more than likely never going to utilize during your lifetime, you can be more comfortable making decisions with what you're going to do with that. It's, for an example, if you take like a single person that's got some kids and they've accumulated more than what they're ever going to utilize, they can either A, wait to pass that on at death and lean more into that frugality that they've lived their life with, or B, they could say there's things I want to do in life. They could say there's things that I'd like to have that I never had. But they could also look at it from the standpoint of, can I get enjoyment out of it with the people that I'm going to leave it to while I'm alive? And so a lot of times, if you've never looked at it from the standpoint that part of what once you've retired, so many times what happens is people reach retirement, but then they keep handling their finances as if they're preparing for retirement when they're already retired. So if they literally just look at what it takes for them to live life, and they put that in a bucket, and they know that they can live out the rest of their life the way they're currently accustomed, that means all of that excess is in that second pool. It's something that's going to be more than likely inherited. So what they do with it is not going to affect their current lifestyle. So then they can make intelligent decisions if there was something they wanted in life, if they wanted to be able to travel in life while they can still travel, because obviously if they lose their physical ability or their mental capacity, that whole dynamic changes. But a lot of times it's also about, if you're just passing something on, maybe you wanted to take a trip with your family that you didn't do, but you're afraid of doing anything because you're afraid of maybe possibly running out of money or something like that, unless you literally define it and break it down so that you know the differences between the two, because those two pools of money have completely different objectives. And I think that's the thing that a lot of times people just don't take the time to do.
How do you go about like calculating that?
I always tell people this. First of all, formulate a budget. Look at your budget. A lot of times they're living life. They're not under duress, so they stop keeping a budget. But they don't, you need to know what it takes for you to live life the way that you're accustomed. And I say, take that budget, put an extra 20% on it, throw a vacation fund on it, all the things that you would like to do. And then look at what it takes to be able to generate the money that you need, and look for something that gives you a guaranteed basis, something that that you can count on. There's no guessing or anything like that. You know that you have a guaranteed outcome. I believe, especially as you go into retirement, guaranteed outcomes are more important than just projections. And a lot of times what happens is people, they want a guaranteed outcome, but maybe the people that they're dealing with on their finances, they're not about guaranteed outcomes. Maybe they're about projections. But when you know what your budget is and you throw in all the extra stuff, then it's a mathematical equation. You start figuring out what it is exactly that you need to live life. Then you say, things go wrong in life. So I need money that I can go to an emergency. If I got my money that generates my lifestyle, the finances that I need to live life the way I'm accustomed to, I've got to count on the fact that things can happen. And so if things can happen, you got to have something, a pool of money that you can get to in case that happens. So that also becomes part of that first pool. But again, it's a mathematical equation. If I say, look, here's how much money it takes for me to live the rest of my life the way I'm currently accustomed. I want an extra $100,000 in case of something going wrong. After I've done that math, everything over setting to the side, not to say that I can't touch it or anything like that, but the way I utilize the money changes. Because I realize that if that's money that's going to be more than likely inherited, the question is, how do I want people to inherit it? Do I want to spend part of it with them during their lifetime? Do I want to do gifting during their lifetime? Do I want to take a vacation with them? Do I want to help with my grandkids' education? Those type of decisions are easier when you identify how much you've got left. Take your budget, figure out what you need to guarantee that budget, add 20% to it, make sure you got your emergency fund. Then the rest of the money is something that the decision-making process can be a little bit different. It doesn't mean that you're just planning on going out and blowing it all, but it does mean that you have more flexibility compared to the other pool, which is maintaining your lifestyle.
Are there ways to do that like during your working years too? Because I feel like it can be really easy to like spend all this time and effort and mental energy, saving everything for once you retire, or really focusing on that you might be, none of us know how long we're going to live. You might be missing out in the present too. It just seems like a very fine line to kind of walk.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think that people that are, let's just say they're in their 40s, their 50s, and they're trying to figure this out. I think that the starting point, because it's easy to say, here's the thing, it's easy to save money to make a plan to take a trip that you have no idea what the trip looks like. And I think that most of the time, the thought is that, well, I'd like to quit working at this age. And so if I could get my income to this point when I retire, if I could retire early, then, that becomes the goal. But in doing that, they live frugally trying to get there. And then the reality of it is, imagine this, you're living frugally, you're trying to save money, you do a good job at saving money, and you say to yourself, well, you know what, now I could retire at 62. Okay, I don't even have to wait until I'm 67. I'll just retire at 62. But in the meantime, between working and being so frugal, you didn't do anything to really experience life. So you don't ever define what your expectations of retirement are. A lot of times what happens is, and I see it all the time, somebody says, I'm going to retire at 62. Well, let's just say that person's life expectancy was 85. Can you imagine spending 23 years living life the exact same way, that same frugal mentality, not traveling, not doing anything, just surviving? The only thing you gained was that you're not walking into work. I mean, that's like living in Groundhog Day. And so I don't think that they take into consideration and map out what they want their retirement to look like. Because sometimes, people think, well, when I retire, I'm going to, maybe I'll spend less, I'll slow down. But 23 years of sitting around watching TV, mowing the lawn, not traveling, not doing anything, just so that you say you made it and you retired without without doing anything else in life. Here's what you find, because I see those people too, is that they begrudge their counterparts that live life differently.
Really?
Because what they did was they drew a line in the sand on what their expectations in life were. And they were so busy being frugal that they didn't even understand how to define it. If you don't travel, if you don't spend money, if you don't buy things, then that becomes your mindset. You don't even know how to think differently. But then all of a sudden, really what you did was you traded work, you went into retirement, you stopped working, but then you just started living the exact same mundane life. Now you're just trying to figure out what you can do since you're not working.
Yeah, to
and
fill all that
through
time.
the years. Yeah, and so, when I first started, the mindset of everybody was at age 65, you quit working. And people accumulated wealth, and they lived so frugally that they couldn't figure out what to do with themselves. So it wasn't like, the main thing in the beginning of my career, when you talk to people, they probably spent half of their time watching television, half of their time working on some chore around the house. And their form of entertainment was maybe going out to dinner once or twice a week. And so if a person says, hey, I'm going to live frugal because the goal is I don't want to do anything or I want to be a couch potato, hey, you know what? Great. Save till you get there and do that. But the difference is, most people, when they get there, that's not their intention. And you can only play so much golf. Now some guys might argue with that. But, over the long haul, I think for younger people, define where you want to go. Don't just call it retirement. Define what you want your retirement to look like and then work towards that. And I think that for people that are more on the cusp or are retired, remember, if you are retired, you're not saving towards a retirement. And the thing that you have to do is actually at that point is define those two pools of money and make intelligent decisions based on understanding the objective of that pool of money. And so I think if people could look at it from that standpoint, they might be able to overcome just the fear of making any new decision, the fear of making a bad decision, and just being stuck where they're at.
That does it for this edition of Not Your Father's 2 Cents. Sources used in this episode will be linked in the description. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll meet you back here in the next episode.